Hello everyone, it's Octodraws and welcome to Lesson 9, Future Indicative and Infinitive Active of Omega Verbs. Kalon esukia, leisure is a fine thing. This is a quote from Periander. Leisure is going to be translated as esukia. A fine thing is kalon. Notice that there's no esti. In English, we translate this is here. And for that word to line up, you would expect an esti here, but you don't have one. There's something a little bit strange about this, and that's that esukia is a feminine word and kalon is a neuter word. And despite having different genders, they're still corresponding. Kalon is translated as a fine thing specifically because kalon is neuter. 49, the future tense. This tense has the same personal endings as the present. It differs from the present only as to the stem, which it forms by adding sigma to the verb stem. In the case of verbs whose stem ends in a mute, the sigma is the occasion of certain changes. A mute can also be a sudden stop of sound or air, and sometimes mutes are called stops or occlusives. If you want some examples of mutes, you can look here, like this p, beta, and phi, kappa, gamma, and chi, and tau, delta, and theta. All of these are mutes. You can further break down mutes in these three ways. 1. A labial, which is made by your lips, unites with sigma to form psi, the ps sound. When it says unites, it really just means combines. So, as you can see here, you have a p, and then when it goes to the future, you add a sigma right here, and then because these two contract, it turns into a psi. 2. A palatal, which is made on the roof of your mouth, combines with sigma to form xi, and that's the k and the s sound. A dental, which is made with your teeth before sigma is dropped or removed. So first, it gives you an example of a labial, and it gives you pempo. So this p right here turns into a psi, and then it gives you a palatal with ago. This gamma turns into the ks sound, so xi. An example of option 3 is a throidzo, which has a zeta. This zeta turns into a sigma. In most instances, the stem is readily recognized in the present tense, but verbs with stem in tau tau are palatals, and most verbs with stems in zeta are dentals. In case of doubt, consult the general vocabulary at the end of the book. So what it's saying is that when you see tau tau, it functions as this. And when you see a zeta, it works as a dental. The reason why it separates these two are because these are double consonants, meaning that this is a t sound and then a second t sound. This is slightly hard for a lot of Americans to understand, me myself being an American, because this is one syllable and the break is there in English, but in Greek, the syllable break is right here. So when you say pulato, you're not just saying pulato like an American, you're saying pulatto. There's a very distinct syllable break and stop right there. Zeta actually has two letters in it, a delta and a sigma. And since delta follows this 3 rule, that means that zeta is also going to follow the 3 rule. And now it gives you pauso as an example of the future indicative, meaning I stop. Here's your root, then you add this sigma, and then you add your ending. And here's your future infinitive, pau, plus the sigma, and then the ending. Although the tense changed, you can see that these endings are exactly the same as the present indicative. So, o eis eomen ete usi. 50. Indirect discourse. A. Verbs whose meaning implies mental action, saying, thinking, or the like. These mental action verbs are also called head verbs. Head verbs are pretty much any verb you can do with your head, such as speaking, hearing, seeing, and obviously thinking, the most important one. You're going to learn a lot of words for thinking, learning Greek. The general sense sent may be stated indirectly. I believe the general to be sending, or I believe the general to have sent. I believe that the general is sending, or I believe that the general sent. So the best way to think about indirect discourse is I think that, and then anything after that is indirect discourse. B. In Latin, the main verb in the quoted statement is always infinitive. The same construction is frequently found in Greek. What it should say, to put Greek at the center point, is that Greek often uses an infinitive to introduce indirect statements, but oftentimes it uses different constructions. In Latin, the subject of the infinitive in indirect discourse is always accusative. The same is true for Greek unless the infinitive has the same subject as the introductory verb. in which case the subject of the infinitive is omitted and any word in agreement with that unexpressed subject is nominative. Wow, that's a lot. Greek oftentimes uses an accusative as its subject in indirect statements. However, Greek oftentimes omits its subject in indirect statement. In instances where the subject of the main clause is the same as the indirect statement, it is much more likely for that subject to not be repeated and be omitted. I think it's a little bit more easy if we just use some examples. Nomidzo ton strategon dioxein. I think the general will pursue. Since ton strategon is accusative, that means that it's going to be the subject of the indirect statement. Dioxein, being an infinitive, is going to introduce the indirect statement. Nomidzo dioxein. I think I shall pursue. In this phrase, the subject is implied to be the same because there's no accusative subject. The Propylaea, the gateway to the Acropolis. And here you can see Reggie perched up there. Now it's going to give you another example of indirect discourse. The tense of the infinitive in the quoted statement, regardless of the tense of the introductory verb, is the same as that used in the original statement. Hoi polemioi diokousi. So this means that the enemy is or are pursuing. Nomidze, tous polemius diokein. He thinks the enemy are pursuing. Nomidze, being in the present, is going to take a present infinitive. In English, it's very similar. However, there's different verb tenses in English. In English, instead of using infinitives, we use the present tense, then we use a present perfect. So here we can see thinks in the present simple, and then we have are pursuing in the present perfect. This is the same thing for this sentence here. Enomidze tous polemius diokein. He thought that the enemy were pursuing. Since the main verb, enomidze, is in the imperfect, diokein is going to take a present infinitive. I think this is a good time to introduce what principal parts are. Principal parts are the forms you go to when inflecting a verb. You don't have to memorize exactly what every principal part does, even though it would be good to. In Greek, there are 6 principal parts, whereas in Latin, there are 4. I'm going to be using the verb luo, because it's pretty regular, as an example to go through each of them. In the first principal part shows the present and the imperfect. The first principal part takes the root, and it doesn't add anything to it. However, once you have your root set, you add the endings for your inflection. So when you want to say I, you add this omega. And when you're in the imperfect, you add an augment, and then you have your secondary tense ending. Your second principal part is for the future active in middle. Here, for your future, add a sigma. So there's also a pattern on how these principal parts change. The present is also where you can usually find the root in its most normal form. However, it's oftentimes easier to find the root in the aorist active, otherwise known as the third principal part. For now, we just need to focus on these first 2 principal parts, and that's what you're going to see in the dictionaries. 51 vocabulary. Arco, arxo, your first principal part, and your second principal part, this being the present and this being the future. Begin, rule, command. And oftentimes it takes a genitive object. So in English, you'd say I rule over something. Think of that over as your genitive. Dioko, dioxo, to pursue. Again, here's your first principal part, and here's your second principal part. Tura, as, he, a door. Hai turai. Often used of military headquarters or of the king's court. Compare sublime port. One example of a derivative is thyroid. Iskuras a on, strong. Melo meleso, intend, delay, be about to. Usually with future infinitive. Oftentimes, it introduces indirect statement. So this would be considered a head verb. Nomidzo, believe, think, with an infinitive. Again, another head verb. Hadas u he, road. Or root. It gives you Exodus as an example. Peto, peso. Persuade. Hupoptuo, hupoptuso. Suspect. Hupa meaning under and optuo meaning to look. Oftentimes it takes an infinitive. Again, another head verb. 2 derivatives that it gives you are hypodermic and optic. So hypo meaning under and dermic, your skin. Optic meaning to look. Same thing here.
All right, now everyone, take a second to do your exercises. And here we go.
52 exercises. A. Identify the person and number of the following forms and give the corresponding forms of the present. Here you have third person plural, pampusi. Here you have first singular, agamon. Here you have third singular, enkrape. Pulaxes is second singular, and that changes into pulates. Athroidzo is first person singular, and it changes to athroidzo. Arxete turns into archete, and it's second person plural. Lucein turns into luein, and it's an infinitive. B. Translate. 1. Hoi barbaroi. Hupoptusi ta erga. The barbarians will suspect the deeds. Hoi barbaroi being barbarians, will suspect being hupoptusi, and ta erga being deeds. Nominative, third person plural. Future active indicative, ta erga. Neuter accusative plural. 2. Enamidzamen tus barbarus uk hupoptuen ta dora. We do not believe that the barbarians expect the gifts. Enamidzamen is first person plural, present active indicative. We believe. Tus barbarus, masculine accusative plural, the barbarians. Tus barbarus is going to be the subject of an infinitive clause or indirect discourse. Hupoptuen is our verb. Since it's in the infinitive, we know that this is going to be the verb directing the indirect discourse. One thing that helps translating is identifying both accusatives before deciding which one's the verb. Oftentimes, since one is neuter, that is very rarely going to be the subject of the indirect discourse. Remember, since uk is an adverb, it can only modify verbs. Uk has to go with enamidzamen. There's actually a separate word, me, if you want to use a negative in indirect discourse, but you don't have to worry about that right now. 3. Mele tes koras arxein. He intends to rule the land. Since this is third person singular, it can be either he, she, or it. Mele is a head verb, so therefore you should be looking for an infinitive. Arxein, and here it is. Arxein only takes genitive objects when you're ruling over something. He rules over the land. Since there are no further accusatives, arxein has to have the same subject as mele, being he, she, or it. 4. Ten destratian, peses ten macran, hodon pulatin. However, you will persuade the army to guard the big road. De, being an adverb, translates to however. First, let's find our verb. Peses is second person singular, future active indicative. So you will persuade. Persuade is a head verb, and now we should expect an infinitive. Pulatain. Pulatain is our verb for indirect discourse. Now we need to look for an accusative to see if there's any type of subject for this indirect discourse. You can find two infinitives that are potentially the subject of our indirect discourse. First one, we have tein stratian, and the second one is tein macron hodon. Roads typically aren't doing much guarding, so I'm not going to use that as my subject. Tein stratian. The army does guard. Armies are known for guarding, so I'm going to take that as my subject. You will persuade the army to guard. Since tein macron hodon is in the accusative, you expect it to be the object of pulatain, so guarding the large road. Hodon, despite being from the second declension, is actually feminine. That's why macron goes with it. 5. Hoi de polemioi ten iskuran pulakein lususin. De, which I translate as yet. However, de could be any number of things. First, let's find our verb, lususin. Lususin is third person plural, future active indicative. We need a plural subject, which is hoi polemioi. So, hoi polemioi, the enemies, destroy or loosen. Now we need some kind of direct object, because they have to loosen something. Ten iskuran pulakein, the strong garrison. 6. Dioxamen ton angelan para tas tu strategu turas. First, let's find our verb. Dioxamen. Dioxamen is first person plural, future active indicative. We will pursue. Now you should expect an accusative. Ton angelan, the messenger. Alongside para tas turas. Para is going with turas because tas, the word that modifies turas, comes right after it. Para turas alongside the doors. Whose doors? Tu strategu, the generals, in the genitive. 7. Al hoi men tus polemius paususen, hoide ta epitidea athroisusen. Al is either but or however. Since there's a hoi men and a hoi de, the subject has to be some and others. Now, let's look for the verb. Paususen. Third person plural, future active indicative. Some will stop, now look for an accusative, τους πολέμιους, the enemies. But others, athroisusin, will collect ta epitedeia, the useful things or provisions, and oftentimes money. 8. Haden nomidze, kalen hadon agen, dia tes arches. But he believes he leads a good path because of his rule. De is an adverb and it translates to but. Nomidze is our verb and it's third person singular and it means he believes. Nomidze has to be he because there's an omicron right here. Since nomidze is a head verb, expect an infinitive, agen, he believes, repeat him as the subject, he, agen, our infinitive in indirect discords, leads, kalen hadon, a good path, dia, taking a genitive, meaning because of, tes, his, arches, rule. C, complete. 1. Hupaptusen hoi polemioi, tan strategon lusen, tas spondas. Hoi polemioi is plural, therefore you need a third plural subject. Strategon must be accusative because of this tan here. Since hupaptusen is a head verb, expect an infinitive. Lusen. Lusen has to have that sigma because it's future, just like this verb here, the main verb of the main clause. The enemies suspect that the general will dismantle the treaty. 2. Meles luen ten hadon. Very importantly, notice that it's a question. Will you intend, expect an infinitive, luen in the same tense, ten hadon. Do you intend to destroy the road? Since there's a hoi men and a hoi de, expect both subjects in both clauses to be third person plural. Some, third person plural, future active indicative. Hoi men dioxusi, will pursue. Tous polemius. Hoi de, others, expect another third person plural, future active indicative. Harpadzusi, because it's will seize. Ta epitedeia, the provisions. D, write in Greek. 1. But the barbarians were collecting the horses in silence. But is either Allah or de. You can't really tell because they're both the same in English. It's probably Allah though. But I wrote de. Hoi barbaroi. Since it's the subject, it has to be masculine nominative plural. We're collecting is our verb. Therefore, athroidzo is the verb that we should be thinking about. And then we should put it in the imperfect. So, third person plural, imperfect active indicative, athroidzon, tous hippus, the direct object must be an accusative, and then in silence. This in oftentimes means dative, and it's a dative of manner. 2. With a shout, we were seizing the provisions. With a shout, dative of manner, kraugai, we can just put that into the end of the verb, we're seizing. Harpadzo, in the imperfect, first person plural, imperfect active indicative, herpadzamen, the provisions, direct object, expect an accusative, ta epitedeia. 3. The man used to write to his brother. Man can either be ha or anthropos, whichever you prefer. Egrape, third person singular, and then used to write has to be an imperfect active indicative. To his brother, expected dative, toi adelpoi. 4. The works were ancient but beautiful. First, there's a contrast. So the works are ancient but beautiful. Since there's a comparison, I'm going to add men and de. Since ta erga is a neuter nominative plural, it takes a singular verb, ain. The works were. Archaia, ancient, and it's going to have the same ending because it has the same gender, case, and number as erga. De, but beautiful, kala. Again, kala is going to have the same gender, case, and number as the works, ta erga. 5. They were brave in speech. Word directly translates to ason. They, we can just assume that it's part of ason. Agatoi, I chose. Masculine, but it could also be feminine. In speech is a dative of manner. Lagoi. I like this example because it gives you a very good insight into ancient Greek thought, but it only gives you half of it for some reason. In a lot of ancient Greek texts and ancient Greek thought, there's this very big concern about people being brave in speech, but bad in their actions. 53. Word formation. Many verbs with epsilon in the stem or root have cognate nouns or adjectives with omicron instead of epsilon. When something is cognate, it means that they derive from the same root or stem. These four are all examples of words that are verbs and nouns that come from the same stem or root. When there's an epsilon, it's in E grade. However, when there's an omicron, it's in O grade. E grade often has the verbs, whereas O grade often has the omicron. So let's derive a cognate by ourselves. I'm going to use Lego as our example. First, we need to identify our root, and our root is this lambda blank gamma. We can then fill in this blank spot with either an epsilon to tell that it's a verb, or you can fill the blank spot with an omicron to say that it's a noun. Compare Latin tego, I cover, toga, cloak. In English, I sing or song. This is actually common not just in Latin, but almost every Indo-European language. And you put an E if you want it to be a verb, or you put it with an O if you want it to be a noun. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember, be positive, be yourself. Peace.